In this lesson, we'll consider the extent to which Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state. We'll begin by looking at what we mean by totalitarian state, and if you're a GCSE student, you should probably make a list with two sides. On one side, ways in which Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state, and on the other side, ways in which it appeared not to be a totalitarian state. So let's begin by looking at what we mean. There is no one set definition of a totalitarian state, but this definition by Carl Friedrich, a political thinker, hits a lot of very practical points. So the first thing is an official ideology, a fixed way of thinking. Did the Nazis appear to have that? To what extent did they have an official ideology, and how coherent was it? How organised? A single mass party, police control based upon terror, total control over the media, total control over the military and the armed forces, and last of all, total control of the economy. Although of those six things, we'll consider how the Nazi Party in some ways appears to embody them, although in other ways it appears not to in some ways. Sorry for overusing the word ways there. So let's have a look at the theory then. So the SA was purged in 1934 from within the Nazi Party. If you remember, that was headed by Ernst Röhm, and it presented something of a threat to Hitler and other Nazis, and so they were purged. In that way, that was the violence of that purge to ensure full support within the ranks of the Nazi Party certainly is evidence for them being very totalitarian. There is no room for dissent, no room for disagreement, and violence is used in order to achieve unity. After that, there were 3.5 years of political peace leading up to 1937-1938. There was an attempt, certainly, to remodel German society. All organisations were coordinated and brought under the umbrella of the Nazi Party. There were no trade unions anymore, there were no private societies. Everything had to be under the umbrella of the Nazi Party. It had to follow Nazi values and beliefs, at least in theory. All areas of German life then were reorganised, but that's what the Nazis wanted, and that's how it appeared on the surface. And in many ways, of course, with the instruments of both terror and propaganda, it was difficult for people to go against that. But we can have a look at the extent to which certainly no individual or group could avoid the long arm of the Nazi Party. If they wanted to join any organisation, as we've said, it had to be a Nazi-approved organisation. But to what extent was the control total? So in many ways then, but for both German men and German women, they were supposed to be accountable for their thoughts and feelings. This rather sinister Gestapo poster, I think the sort of spooky eyes there are deliberate, indicates the degree to which you would not be free, for example, to voice public and open criticism of the Nazi Party. So to that extent, it appears to be quite totalitarian, your thoughts and your actions, although it's very difficult to police people's actual thoughts and feelings and what they will say in the privacy of their own home or with very trusted friends and confidants. The demands of the Nazi state were, in theory, again, more important than the individual. Your individual desires, ambitions were subordinate to the Nazi state and the so-called Aryan race, which the Nazi state claimed to be fighting for. Again, in that way, seeming to be totalitarian. However, in some ways, the reality was different. So again, if you're a GCSE student, you can make notes in which perhaps it wasn't as totalitarian. Certainly a stark and a violent state, and undeniably, in many ways, very totalitarian. But there are slight exceptions. For example, until the outbreak of war, Germany was still open to foreign journalists. Unlike, for example, the USSR, which in most of those metrics that Carl Friedrich used is definitely more totalitarian in many respects. Foreign criticism, in fact, of what Hitler was doing to the churches within Germany actually caused him to withdraw some of those measures. So to that extent, in terms of control of the media, allowing in the foreign journalists, yes, local media was strictly censored, however, foreign media were allowed in. So there's a slight exception there. This, however, again, this is change over time. So you'll see, as with persecution of Jewish people and other minority groups, 1939 onwards, the picture changes considerably. And if you ever get an essay question about that, and it states a time period, look carefully, so make sure you describe before and after major turning points like the war. So in 1939, there were 25,000 political prisoners, Germans, within concentration camps. A few years later, this had risen to 250,000. So certainly repression, and repression of this nature is very totalitarian, had increased during the war. On the other hand, the Nazi government itself was not such a well-oiled machine of control. In many ways, there was confusion and a lack of coordination. This is something that Hitler probably actually wanted, but it certainly weakened the overall control of the Nazi government. And let's explore why. Certainly, nobody questioned Hitler's authority. What there were fierce struggles for power in the ranks below. There were a confusing and overlapping number of government ministries, and key figures often had to fight and argue with each other, try to get the approval of Hitler for their own projects. Each government minister and party official basically fought for their own interests. Now, this confusion, this lack of definition, meant that people vied, they competed for the favour of the Führer. Well, that strengthened Hitler's position personally, but in terms of the efficiency and organisation of the Nazi state and its control, it weakened to an extent government control, this confusion and lack of organisation. So I hope you've considered in which aspects, the 6 aspects we looked at, was the Nazi state totalitarian? In what ways was it not totalitarian? Was Nazi Germany a totalitarian state or not? Well, you make up your mind.